On May 15, 2012, at 10:13 p.m., a call comes into 911. On the other end of the line is a child's voice. It is barely discernible, faintly audible as background noise cuts off each word. The operator waits, but cannot understand who it is. The voice sounds weak, almost bewildered. It says only a few phrases. Help, Dad brought new locks. These words sound simple, yet they are no less unsettling. Why new locks? What does it mean? And most importantly, who needs them? The call does not last long. The connection breaks. The operator, trying to call back, receives no answer. No other sounds. Only emptiness, as if the world itself has swallowed this signal. In desperation, the operator checks the data. But all that can be found out is that the call was made from a payphone at an abandoned gas station along Highway 34. This is an area that can hardly be called bustling. At first glance, it is an unremarkable place. A patrol dispatched to the scene finds nothing. No signs of struggle, no traces of a person. Just an abandoned building and an empty highway. For several days, no one pays much attention to this call. And although it is mentioned in local news, everyone quickly forgets about it, dismissing it as a coincidence. Nevertheless, this incident leaves traces in the memory of some people. The call was recorded, and although it was deemed an unidentified threat, it did not fade into obscurity. Something about this call is unsettling. It leaves no peace. Even if at first glance it seemed like an insignificant coincidence, gradually this call will become more than just an isolated episode. It will be the first signal that leads to the unraveling of a seemingly peaceful family nest, hidden behind closed doors. In Providence County, there is the Olson family. At first glance, they are a perfectly ordinary farming couple, like many in the area. Mark and Brenda live on a large farm, where they keep animals, cultivate the land, and actively participate in the local religious community. If you ask neighbors or parishioners who they are, the answer will be one: an exemplary family steeped in tradition and faith. The Olsons are the kind of people everyone sees as pillars and examples. Their home is always clean, and their daily routines are what one might consider exemplary. He works on the farm, she manages the household, helping him and always ready to assist others. The couple actively supports church projects and advocates for moral values. In the eyes of local residents, they are a model of righteousness. These are the people no one would even think anything bad about. Everything seemed perfect until information emerged that the family had adopted 2 children. In 2002, they welcomed 2 children, a brother and a sister, into their family. Leo, 8 years old, and Maya, 2 years younger. No one particularly questioned how these children came to live with the Olsons. It simply became known that they took them from an orphanage, who, as it turned out, had no bad stories on file. But if everything were so smooth, we wouldn't have to talk about this. In school reports and meetings with teachers, complaints occasionally surfaced. From conversations with local social services, it became clear that the children had difficulties. They had behavioral problems. At school, there were complaints about disciplinary issues. At church, about restless behavior that sometimes seemed strange. And as for the adults, they said that the children couldn't control themselves, behaved strangely, and were very often stubborn. This began to be perceived as ordinary adolescent problems that had left their mark. Yes, perhaps the children had experienced a difficult past, which, of course, could not help but leave traces in their psyche. These difficulties were met with sympathy and attempts to help. And they were so ordinary, there was nothing unusual about it. But sometimes behind the facade of something ordinary lie things that cannot be explained. Over time, social services began to conduct inspections. Everything was according to plan. Conditions were checked, the house was inspected, and all the time, everything was in order, no violations. Everything seemed clean. The family, in which children and adults lived as one, even gained attention for their good deeds. This created the impression that they had no problems. Everything strictly according to the rules, with all norms observed, until all this collided with one crack, with that 911 call. It was made at an empty gas station. It would seem, what is this trifle? But what was hidden behind this moment called into question everything that we considered normal. That call became the first moment when the Olsons' perfect facade began to crack. But this moment was just the beginning of something bigger. And in the next moment, we will need to understand what is hidden behind this facade, including what is actually happening within the walls of their home. October 22. School fair. An atmosphere of fun, as always at such events. Children, adults, bright toys, tables with treats, and cheerful conversations. Everyone seems to be involved in this small celebration when suddenly a loud bang rings out. It's a sound that makes everyone stop immediately and look around. Tension instantly fills the air. For a few seconds, all noise dies down and everyone freezes. But what happened? It immediately becomes clear. It's just a popped balloon. Perhaps many relax at this moment. It's funny how such simple things can cause panic for a moment. Teacher Evelyn Reed observes the students trying to restore order. She sees several children laughing, others sighing with relief, but her attention is suddenly drawn to one figure. It is Maya Olsen. Her reaction is unexpectedly strong. She doesn't just flinch in fright, she falls to the ground. It looks like a panic attack. Maya hides, covering her head with her hands, as if trying to hide from something terrible. Evelyn sees how the girl's body contracts, how she quietly whispers, unable to stop trembling with emotion. Her fingers clench into fists, and her lips utter the words, "I'll be good, just don't lock me up." This moment changes everything. Everything that happened before seemed like an ordinary school incident, but now everything intensifies. The phrase she uttered leaves no doubt. What did she mean? Why did such words burst out at a moment when everything around was so trivial? Don't lock me up. These words sound frightening, and they, like a key, open the doors to strange and disturbing thoughts. The teacher tries to bring her back to a normal state, but she herself remains perplexed. Maya seems unable to calm down, and her words spin more and more in Evelyn's head. What do they mean? And why is she afraid of precisely what would seem to be absolutely impossible at a fair? When the meeting with Maya's adoptive parents took place later, Brenda Olsen gave a perfectly reasonable explanation. Maya has been through difficult times. She just can't cope with those memories. The words sound logical. Past trauma, of course, could have left a mark on her behavior. This explanation seemingly answers all questions. But Evelyn cannot shake the feeling that something more is hidden behind this version. Not just a difficult past, not just endured hardships. The incident was formally closed. The parents' explanation seemed convincing, and it was all soon forgotten as a random panic attack. But Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just random. She made a note in her journal. This moment is the beginning of something that now gives her no peace. Although the incident was formally resolved, for Evelyn, something began to change. This one moment, this brief but terrible experience of Maya's, made her think about what lay behind the facade of well-being that the Olsens tried to maintain, and she could no longer ignore her doubts. October 28. Leo Olsen enters the school nurse's office. Another ordinary morning, and nothing portends trouble. He looks like a regular schoolboy, a 10-year-old boy who just came for something. The reason for the visit seems trivial: a severe bruised arm. According to him, he fell out of a tree, and this explanation seems quite plausible. Summer games, jumping from branches. What's unusual about that? The nurse, without asking unnecessary questions, begins the examination. Routine work, nothing that could alarm her. In her hands, standard actions. Treating the wound, checking for other injuries. She carefully rolls up the shirt sleeve to better treat the injury. And at that very moment, her gaze stops. Strange marks are visible on Leo's wrist. It's not just a bruise. It's not ordinary abrasions. Symmetrical, almost perfectly round in shape. One such mark on one wrist, exactly the same on the other. They have almost healed, leaving bright traces behind. This could not have been the result of an ordinary fall from a tree. Everything looks too suspicious, and the similarity of the marks on both hands simply cannot be a coincidence. The nurse, continuing to treat the bruise, carefully examines these marks. She understands that this is not just an injury, as she initially thought. Perhaps it is the result of some kind of impact, some kind of restricting movement that left such marks. Thoughts flash through her mind, but she forces herself to concentrate on her work. Nevertheless, she records the discovered marks in the journal, as required by protocol. First the bruise, then the strange marks on the wrists. Every movement, every word will be recorded. She cannot ignore this. All this could be a coincidence, or it could be something more alarming. But either way, she must leave a documented trace. When Leo leaves, the nurse immediately conveys this information to teacher Evelyn Reed. She knows that Evelyn has already been thinking about the oddities in Maya's behavior, and now, with this new observation, the anxiety in her mind only intensifies. In her note, the nurse briefly mentions wrists, strange marks, healed abrasions. This is enough to attract attention, to direct their steps in the right direction. Evelyn Reed, receiving the information, understands that she cannot leave it unattended. These strange coincidences and details begin to form a picture. She had long noticed oddities in both children's behavior, and now this clue somehow connects everything, becoming the first real step in the investigation. A new plan of action is already forming in the teacher's mind. Evelyn Reed sat at her desk, going through another pile of papers, when all three facts, which now, like pieces of a puzzle, fit together into a whole, came to her mind. The 911 call, Maya's reaction to the pop balloon at the fair, and the abrasions on Leo's hands. All these events, which at first glance seemed random and insignificant, now began to form a disturbing picture. Maya, terrified, clutching her hands to her head as if trying to hide from something, her words, "I'll be good, just don't lock me up." The 911 call with mysterious words about new locks. And now the abrasions on Leo's hands, which could not have been the result of a simple fall. Symmetrical marks, as if left by something heavy and rigid, which looked identical on both wrists. All this could not be simple coincidences. With each new fact, Evelyn felt anxiety growing in her mind, and alarm rising in her heart. She was now certain of one thing. Something was wrong with this family. Her gaze fell again on the medical note. Abrasions on the wrists, looks like handcuff marks. Evelyn's thoughts lingered. She understood that her warnings might be mistaken, but she could no longer remain silent, and she decided she must act. The next step was obvious. Evelyn dials the number of the Providence County Sheriff's Office. Her hand trembles slightly as she says the words, "I need to speak to Sheriff Jenkins. It's important." Her suspicions had turned into certainty. At some point, she already knew that this was not just a case of random occurrences. Her intuition could not be wrong. It was more than just strange behavior. It was much more dangerous. When Evelyn met Sheriff Jenkins, her voice was calm, but there was a sense of determination in it. She laid out all the facts, the 911 call, Maya's behavior at the fair, and the strange abrasions on Leo's wrists. She spoke clearly, plainly, not hiding a single detail. The sheriff listened to her attentively, but in his eyes, as expected, there was no expression of alarm. He leaned forward slightly and, it seemed, even with a hint of disbelief, said, "You understand that these are rather serious accusations, and that the Olsen family are respected people in our community." He did not rush. He listened, but his face remained impassive. Evelyn felt her own confidence waver slightly. The sheriff continued to insist on the Olsens' impeccable reputation, their involvement in the community and the church. He did not say that her suspicions were wrong, but he also made no promises. In his report, the sheriff stated that no complaints or violations had been recorded against the family. Everything looked like an ideal family. There was a hint of skepticism in his voice, and this caused Evelyn an internal struggle. In the end, the sheriff promised to conduct a preventative talk with Mark and Brenda Olsen. But no official investigation began. This talk was still a step forward, but there remained a feeling that the authorities were not taking it seriously. Evelyn knew that much more needed to be uncovered. And although the case was not officially opened, she could not just let it go. Now everything depended on what would happen during this talk. Evelyn was ready to continue fighting for what she believed was right, but was her information convincing enough for the sheriff to act decisively? The question remained open, and the tension grew. Evelyn Reed could not shake the feeling that she could not simply stop at what the sheriff had told her. The answers she received were insufficient to calm her anxiety. All that remained for her was to continue searching, even if the authorities did not take her suspicions seriously. She could not afford to stand aside, knowing that something was wrong with the Olsen family. Deciding to act, she began to look for additional information. First, she turned to the school archives. Carefully reviewing the documents, she came across information about former employees who had once worked with the Olsen family. She found the name of a woman who had been a housekeeper in their home until 2003. All that remained was to find this woman's contact details and try to learn more. After several calls and attempts to reach her, Evelyn finally got a phone number. She didn't hesitate long and dialed it. The phone call didn't take long, and although the woman on the other end of the line was clearly cautious, Evelyn still managed to persuade her to talk. She felt that this might be the only opportunity to learn something important. The woman on the other end of the line was initially skeptical, but hearing the persistent and anxious voice of the teacher, decided to reveal a few secrets. The woman, named Karen, said that she was strictly forbidden from entering the Olsons' basement. She couldn't understand why, but every time she tried to find out what was hidden behind the closed doors, she was met with a harsh prohibition. This was common, and she learned not to ask questions, but she was always troubled by the feeling that something was wrong in that basement. But that wasn't all. Karen shared another detail that immediately caused Evelyn deep concern. At night, when she was still working in the house, a strange sound sometimes came from the basement, quiet but distinct. It was a sound like a metal chain, which, according to Karen, sometimes echoed in the night silence. Evelyn felt everything in her head come together into a mosaic, yet terrifying image. The call she heard when Maya said, "Don't lock me up," now had a real explanation. The sound of a chain coming from that very basement made her hair stand on end. These metallic sounds that Karen heard at night now had a connection to what was happening in the Olson home. Evelyn, understanding the importance of this information, persuades Karen to give an official statement. The woman did not immediately agree, but eventually assented. She understood that silence could lead to tragic consequences, and decided to tell everything she knew. Having received her consent, Evelyn immediately relayed the information to Sheriff Jenkins. Now, he had not only the 911 call and her own suspicions, but also the direct testimony of the former housekeeper. Evelyn felt that this was a turning point that could force the sheriff to act. This information became the first real proof that something hidden and horrifying was happening in the Olson home. Now the sheriff had no excuse for inaction. He could no longer ignore this evidence. All that remained was to act. October 29. Sheriff Jenkins finally drives to the Olson farm. By this point, after all the previous alarms, he understands that he cannot continue to ignore all these oddities. The housekeeper's testimony, the children's silence, those strange marks on Leo's hands, all this is no longer just rumors, but how to deal with what still looks like a good family. When the sheriff arrived at the farm, he was met by Mark and Brenda with friendly and hospitable faces. They offered him coffee, invited him into the house, and his attention was immediately drawn to the order prevailing in their home. Everything looked as if there had never been any problems there. The furniture was in its place, the windows clean, in the kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed coffee, everything, as in an ideal family. Seemingly no disturbing signs, nothing that could make one doubt their way of life. At first, the sheriff felt doubt. Perhaps this was all just a misunderstanding. He was not prepared for such calmness. Even the visit itself, with its official appearance, seemed to have been anticipated. Everything happened under the pretext of a routine check. Nothing unusual. However, the sheriff understood that he had to ask about what bothered him, about the children, about what he had learned. He started a conversation, carefully steering it in the right direction, asking questions, but he received confident answers from Mark. Mark spoke with full confidence about upbringing, about the difficulties they had faced. He recounted how hard it was to adapt the children after they came to their home, how much they had endured. But he answered all questions confidently, without any hint of anxiety. The children sat in the corner of the living room and remained silent. They did not interrupt, did not interfere. This silence was alarming, but the sheriff could not focus on it without having facts. The sheriff continued to question, but towards the end of the visit, realizing that he needed to take the next step, he asked to inspect the basement. This was a routine request that could have been perceived as a formality, but for him, it was an important moment to gauge their reaction. After all, he could have just left it as a recommendation, something like, "You show me and I'll leave," but for him, it was crucial. Mark's expression unexpectedly changed sharply. At first, he seemed relaxed, open, but when the sheriff made his request, his eyes immediately became cold. He didn't answer right away, but his intonation and gestures said it all. He was categorical in his refusal, without any attempt to explain, without polite words, just a firm no. He said that the basement was private property and he saw no point in the inspection. This was the moment the mask fell. He didn't just refuse, he was clearly troubled by this question, as if something was in the basement that couldn't be revealed. This was the moment the sheriff felt he had something to work with. The refusal was immediate and harsh. He realized that there was something in this house that they were trying to hide. This refusal, which in an ordinary situation might have seemed just another defense of private property, became a decisive piece of evidence in the context of the entire investigation. The sheriff recorded in his report, "The refusal was immediate and unreasonably harsh." This changed the status of the case. Now, it was no longer possible to talk about random events, random coincidences. Everything in this house began to look different. The basement became not just a part of the house, it became the epicenter of suspicions. Now the sheriff could not continue to work in the same vein. He was forced to act. This was a turning point that forced him to set aside all doubts and begin an investigation, not just a check. The case became more than just an analysis of strange events. Now it was an investigation, and with each new step, it became more dangerous for those who lived behind these closed doors. After Mark Olson categorically refused to let the sheriff into the basement, the investigation took a new turn. At this point, it became clear that any doubts the sheriff had must be dispelled. He understood that if he did not continue the investigation, the opportunities to find evidence would disappear. The Olsons' demeanor, their calmness and confidence, and then this sharp refusal like a magnet attracted attention. Now the sheriff could not stop. He initiates an undercover check and decides to direct his efforts towards material evidence. In search of connections that could confirm his suspicions, the sheriff and investigators began to examine the Olson family's financial transactions. What are they spending money on? Who are these people living on the farm who are so meticulously hiding something? Were there any purchases that could explain the suspicious events? The first step was to examine purchases made by the family in recent months. This was a logical move that could lead to material traces. Investigators requested information about large purchases at hardware stores that could be related to their home. This was a simple but extremely important decision, as such purchases often remain invisible to the naked eye. While conducting the analysis, investigators stumbled upon a receipt that immediately caught their attention. It listed an amount of $84.50, not too large for purchases, but completely lacking any logical explanation given the previous events. The transaction was made at a hardware store in a neighboring county 6 months ago. This purchase immediately stood out among others, and the sheriff understood that it could be a key to solving the mystery. He requested a copy of the receipt and found that the list of items included 2 objects that immediately raised questions: 2 steel chains and 2 barn locks. These items perfectly matched what had already been found during the investigation: the sounds of chains, mentions of locks, and conversations with the children, words spoken by Maya. The circle was closed. Investigators could not help but notice that chains and locks are not just household items. These things could be related to what was happening in the Olson home. And although there was no direct evidence yet, the police now had an important lead that required further action. When the investigator contacted the store clerk, he easily identified Mark Olson from a photo. Now, the investigators had not just a purchase, but also a specific person who was behind this transaction. The clerk confirmed that this person had indeed bought these items. This was an important confirmation that added confidence to the investigation. It seemed that all the details were starting to fall into place. However, the key point was the explanation for the purchase itself. The clerk, recalling his conversation with Mark, said that he explained the purchase as a need to protect the barn. This explanation seemed absurd. Why such serious locks and chains for a barn when most people use such things for other purposes? This version became more and more doubtful, and the situation itself more ominous. In light of the refusal to show the basement, this explanation acquired an alarming undertone. Having gathered all this data, the sheriff understood that he now had sufficient grounds to file for a warrant. The lie Mark told the salesman became not only suspicious, but also a key piece of evidence. This evidence linked the purchase to the secrets hidden behind the basement doors. And now, with evidence in hand, the sheriff could no longer back down. A search warrant was imminent. After the sheriff obtained all the necessary testimonies, he knew he couldn't rely solely on guesses. To strengthen his position and make the search warrant request more justified, he needed to get an expert opinion. The sheriff understood that his suspicions had to be confirmed not only by facts but also by science. He was confident that this expert examination could become the crucial element that would give the case official legal weight. The sheriff handed photographs of Leo's wrist abrasions to a forensic medical examiner for an unofficial consultation. These pictures clearly showed marks that could not simply be the result of a normal fall from a tree. He didn't expect immediate results, but he understood that this was an important step that would help him not only dispel doubts but also strengthen the evidence base. The expert, upon receiving the photographs, said he was ready to provide a preliminary conclusion, but at that moment, it was merely an unofficial opinion. The sheriff was nervous, realizing that every word from the expert would be critically important. When the answer came a few days later, the expert issued a conclusion that immediately dispelled any doubts. Based on the nature of the injuries, their symmetry, and depth, he noted that such traumas clearly could not have been sustained from an accidental fall. He explained in detail that the abrasions on both hands were identical in shape and depth, indicating prolonged exposure to some kind of restraining device. These were not just accidental injuries. These traumas indicated that the person had been under physical restraints for a long time. The expert also noted that the injuries clearly did not match typical damages sustained from a fall or even from ordinary outdoor activities. They were inconsistent with common household injuries. The conclusion was staggering. The abrasions indicated prolonged wearing of restraining devices, such as handcuffs or chains. This was scientific confirmation that destroyed all previous versions of accidental occurrences. The sheriff knew that now he had everything necessary to continue the investigation. This data was immediately attached to the search warrant request. Despite the conclusion being unofficial, its significance was enormous. Based on this conclusion, as well as witness testimonies and other evidence, the sheriff knew that he could not continue the investigation without an official warrant. With each step, with each new fact, the case became heavier and more layered. Now the sheriff had three key elements that guaranteed success: the housekeeper's testimony, the receipt for the purchase of chains and locks, and the expert conclusion. These three elements transformed the investigation from a superficial examination into a full-fledged case with real evidence. The sheriff filed the warrant request with confidence that he now had everything for a successful search. The question was no longer, will the warrant be issued? He was confident that his actions now had legal force. When the sheriff began preparing the warrant request, he learned that the Olsons were aware of the investigation. Through their lawyer, they received information about police actions and decided to launch a preemptive strike. This was a classic move: turn the accusers into the accused, undermine trust in those conducting the investigation. The Olson family was ready to defend themselves, and their actions became the first response to the pressure being exerted on them. A few days later, the Olsons' lawyer filed an official complaint against the school and personally against Evelyn Reed. They claimed that she exceeded her authority and exerted psychological pressure on the children, manipulating them for her own purposes. This was not only an attempt to fend off accusations, but also a strategy to compromise the main witness. At first, these accusations seemed absurd, but their determination and confidence made the sheriff and other participants in the investigation feel a slight unease. The complaint alleged that Reed, with her attention to the children's difficult behavior, was actually manipulating the situation, provoking them into certain reactions. In this context, her actions appeared not as concern for well-being, but as pressure, forcing the children to say what was advantageous to adults. This created not only legal, but also moral pressure on the investigation. Now everyone began to wonder, was the teacher herself manipulating? Perhaps all her actions were part of a more complex game than it seemed at first glance. The Olsons actively claimed that Leo's injuries were the result of his tendency to self-harm, and that his behavior had always been unpredictable and problematic. This was a step to try to attribute any peculiarities to behavioral problems. They also claimed that Maya's reaction at the fair, her sudden fear and silence, were the result of mistakes by school staff who didn't know how to work with traumatized children. All of this was explained as a consequence of the children's inability to adapt to a new life, and there was nothing suspicious in their behavior. However, their version of self-harm and school incompetence looked increasingly absurd, especially as each new fact contradicted these explanations. Their attempts to mislead the investigation created more questions than answers. Every explanation was contradictory, and every new statement only strengthened suspicions that they were hiding much more than they wanted to admit. For a short time, their attack created real confusion among school leadership. Some staff members began to doubt Evelyn's actions, which delayed some processes. Questions arose about how and why she began her investigation, how she could so insistently delve into the personal affairs of a family that seemed so respected in the community. This slowed the sheriff's actions and could have prevented him from obtaining additional evidence within his investigation. But in the end, their tactics could not long delay the investigation. The false accusations and attempts at manipulation were useless. The sheriff, having received expert conclusions and evidence, knew that he had everything necessary to continue the investigation. The complaint filed by the lawyer could not overturn the search warrant already issued. The Olsons tried to sidetrack the investigation, but its results could not be ignored. They faced the law, and now all their defense mechanisms only served to strengthen their guilt. While their strategy slowed the process, it could not stop it. The sheriff continued to move forward, knowing that any attempts to distract attention from the main evidence were doomed to fail. The concern and secrecy displayed by the Olsons only became another step towards their exposure. While awaiting the search warrant, the sheriff and his team began to thoroughly investigate the past of Mark and Brenda Olson. If they had hidden nothing suspicious, their biographies would likely have been open books. However, the more investigators dug, the more questions arose. Initially, their attention was drawn to something entirely ordinary. The Olsons moved to Iowa in 2001. What could be suspicious about changing residence, it seemed? But here's the strange thing. Official documents didn't indicate any reason for this move. They simply disappeared from Utah, leaving no trace behind. This created an intriguing gap. What did they leave behind and what were they fleeing from? Investigators sent inquiries to law enforcement agencies in Utah to try and clarify this point. Expectations were met. The answers came, and they became even more mysterious. It turned out that the Olsons didn't just change their place of residence. In Utah, they were members of a closed religious community that held radical views. This wasn't just a conservative group. It was a community with extremely cruel practices based on physical purification from sin. These methods of physical purification were known to only a few outside their community, but they always remained in the shadows, hidden from society. These practices included not only lengthy and agonizing rituals, but also cruel treatment of those who, in the community's opinion, were unrighteous. The Olsons, it turned out, were deeply involved in these practices. This explained their extreme attitude towards discipline and upbringing, as well as the methods they used to correct those who entered their home. However, the most unexpected moment came when investigators discovered that the Olsons left this community in 2001 not because they were against its cruel practices, but on the contrary, because they were too cruel even for it. Archival records showed that an internal conflict arose in their community concerning excessive interpretation of doctrine. They were expelled for views and methods deemed excessive by even their strict local leaders. This unexpected turn revealed the true face of the Olsons. They were not merely attracted to the idea of strictness and order. They were fanatics, convinced of their righteousness, ready to apply extreme methods to correct those who, in their opinion, needed correction. Their actions no longer seemed simply cruel. They looked like part of an ideology in which they believed. This explained their attitude towards children, their educational methods, as well as their secrecy and desire to control everything around them. Now that it was clear their motivation was much deeper than a simple desire for order, the sheriff and his team began to connect all the evidence into one picture. This was not just cruel treatment of those they took into their family. This was a continuation of their own ideological tenets. Everything they did corresponded to their own understanding of how to correct a person. And this cruelty, hidden under the guise of piety, opened up an entirely new perspective on what was happening behind the closed doors of their home. Now, understanding that their actions were based not merely on personal aggression, but on a deep ideology, investigators could move forward. This information not only clarified their behavior, but also definitively solidified suspicions. The Olsons were not just cruel people. They were fanatics, ready to employ extreme measures to realize their beliefs. October 30, 6 o'clock a.m. Police cars pull up to the Olsons' farm. Tension hangs in the air. The moment of truth has arrived. Sheriff Jenkins and his team know that everything that led up to this culminates in this decisive moment. They cannot make a mistake. Having gone through all stages of the investigation, from testimonies to expert conclusions, they are ready to begin the search that might uncover a horrifying truth. Sheriff Jenkins approaches the house, where Mark Olson is already meeting him at the door. In the sheriff's hands is the search warrant, and he presents it without hesitation. This is an official step that legitimizes police actions. He informs Mark that they are going to inspect his house and that they will be checking the basement. Everything now depends on how the family reacts. Mark nods silently, not attempting to object. He makes no moves to stop the process, and the investigators begin to move into the basement. On the way down into the dark and dusty corridor, the atmosphere becomes increasingly heavy. The sheriff feels the growing tension compress the space around them. This isn't just a search, it's the culmination of what could have ended as a routine check, but became a real investigation. The sheriff's gaze falls on the main door at the end of the corridor, which looks as if it's hiding something behind it. This isn't just a basement door, it's a door behind which lies the answer to all questions. When they enter the basement, everyone realizes that this is where the key to the mystery might be. The room at the end of the corridor, as expected, was soundproofed. Everything around seemed designed to hide sounds, any attempts to attract attention from outside. The room was empty, except for 2 children's beds that stood along the walls. These beds were fastened into metal frames, into which steel rings were embedded, rings that couldn't help but attract attention. On the floor lay heavy chains and barn locks. This was not an accident. This was a clearly planned place, created to restrain, to limit. The sheriff and investigators stood in this room, their gazes unable to tear away from these iron objects. Everything associated with these chains and locks now took on a sinister reality. This evidence, right before them, confirmed the worst suspicions they had harbored all this time. This was not just isolation. It was a means of control, a means to restrict freedom in the most literal sense. And this place was designed to hide what was happening from the outside world. However, the strongest piece of evidence in this room was not a chain or a lock, but what the investigators found on the walls. Dozens of children's drawings were hung in the room. In each image, children were depicted alongside their parents, smiling, happy. But there was one terrible detail that sent shivers down the spine. Black bracelets were drawn on the hands and feet of the characters in these drawings. This was a desperate message, hidden from the world, an attempt by the children to express their suffering in the way available to them. On every drawing, this dark detail, which spoke of what they were trying to tell everyone, was really happening to them. These bracelets, a symbol that they were locked up, restricted, unable to leave. The knowledge that all this was happening right under the nose of the entire community, while society continued to believe in the ideal image of the family, became a heavy blow for the sheriff and his team. All the evidence now converged into undeniable proof. At this moment, Mark and Brenda Olson were arrested. There were no more doubts. Everything that happened in that house was a result of their actions, their belief in their own ideals, which they enforced with such cruelty. The question of who was to blame was already resolved. There was no more ambiguity about what was happening in that house. And now, as the sheriff and his team leave the basement, they know that the next chapter of the investigation will only be the beginning of the end for the Olson family. The chains and rings found in the Olsons' basement were immediately sent for examination. This was a decisive step that was meant to dispel all remaining doubts. The findings made in the basement were horrifyingly sinister. But could they truly be decisive? Perhaps the marks on the metal were not enough. Maybe they didn't confirm what was happening in that house. But science can always provide a more precise answer. Forensic experts began meticulous work, examining the chains and rings under a microscope. They knew that even the smallest details could become important. Attention was focused on every scratch, every mark. This was not just an inspection. Every detail could be crucial. Time dragged on. The wait was long, but finally the examination results came. Under the microscope, microscopic particles of epithelium and fabric fibers were found on the inner surface of the rings. These small, seemingly insignificant findings became the very evidence that linked these objects to those who used them. This was not a coincidence. The metal rings and chains were directly related to those who were restrained by them. But who? The question of the origin of these biological traces became crucial. Now, for the experts, only one step remained: to determine whose traces they were. Samples were sent for DNA analysis. All specialists perfectly understood the importance of this moment. DNA comparison could put an end to the investigation. This was no longer just an assumption, but a scientific study that, no matter how it developed, had to yield a precise result. The sheriff knew that everything depended on this analysis. This step could be the final, determining turning point. The anticipation of the results made them tremble. This was a moment when any mistake could lead to catastrophic consequences for the investigation. And so, when the results came, they left no doubt. 100% DNA match. The biological traces found on the metal rings and chains were identical to Leo's and Maya's DNA. This was conclusive proof. The evidence physically linked them to this terrible place, to these chains, to this basement. This was not just a random coincidence. Scientific confirmation definitively closed the case. All versions that attempted to mislead the investigation were now unsubstantiated. Now that all doubts were dispelled, it became clear that the defense's claim that the chains were needed to secure the shed was absolutely false. This explanation was shattered by scientific data. The biological traces found at the crime scene became irrefutable evidence of what had occurred. All of the Olsons' efforts to justify their actions lost their power. Their alibi now crumbled, and their attempts to mislead the investigation were meaningless. This evidence forever destroyed their defense and put an end to the investigation. The investigators now had a complete evidentiary base, and all that remained was to await the execution of the search warrant. Everything pointed to one conclusion. The Olsons tried to hide their real activities, but they could not escape justice. October 30, 11 o'clock a.m. After the search warrant was executed and the evidence found in the basement confirmed the worst suspicions, the time came for Mark Olson's interrogation. In the sheriff's hands was irrefutable evidence, biological traces found on the chains and rings, as well as DNA analysis results. This was clear, undeniable proof that these objects were used to restrict freedom and inflict suffering. The sheriff understood that the moment of truth had arrived. Criminal liability for such crimes was inevitable, but the question remained: would Mark Olson break under pressure or continue to deny his guilt? The sheriff presented the DNA expert results to Mark Olson. He fell silent for a moment. Then his face turned to stone. He no longer tried to deny. He began to give testimony, but it was far from an admission of guilt. The sheriff expected at least words of remorse to come from his mouth, but it did not happen. Instead of admitting guilt, Mark began to talk about the motives and necessity of his actions. It wasn't punishment, he said, his voice remaining calm, as if he saw nothing unusual in his behavior. It was salvation. The devil was in their blood, and I had to cast it out. They were possessed, and only through this purification could they be saved. These words shocked the investigators. Instead of expressing even the slightest regret or admitting his guilt, Mark revealed to them the reason why he and his wife did everything they did. Their actions, according to him, were not just cruel. They were part of some spiritual mission. In their eyes, they were saviors who delivered people from the evil dwelling in their souls. He spoke in detail about his rituals, which, in his opinion, were necessary for exorcising sin and liberating from the tyranny of the devil. For the sheriff and his team, this was a real shock. They expected to hear an excuse or a justification related to an attempt to control children, but instead, they heard a deeply distorted justification in which violence was rationalized by religious ideology. Mark did not hide the fact that he considered his actions necessary and even righteous. He was proud of saving their souls, not considering what they were actually experiencing through his spiritual purifications. The sheriff, trying to understand the depth of Mark's delusions, asked if he realized he was causing the children suffering. The answer was astonishing. "I wasn't hurting them," he said. "It wasn't pain, it was purification. Only their sinful nature suffered." He distinguished physical pain from spiritual suffering, and in his eyes, this justified everything he did. He did not acknowledge the suffering they endured, considering it merely part of the purification process. This became the final point in understanding what was actually happening. The Olsons were not simply cruel to those they took in. They were fanatics who acted according to their religious beliefs, not understanding or unwilling to understand that their actions had nothing to do with spiritual salvation. This was a pure distortion of the truth, in which cruelty and exploitation were transformed into a noble goal. Their motives were so twisted that the sheriff and investigators now saw them not just as criminals, but as people who had lost touch with reality, threatening everyone around them. Mark Olson not only turned out to be guilty of the crimes he committed, his actions were the result of religious extremism, which he fully justified. In his mind, there was no room for remorse, because he sincerely believed that everything he did was salvation. Everything that happened in his house was part of his distorted mission, which he considered sacred. This confession became the final element that destroyed all doubts about his motivation and criminal actions. The investigation now stood on the threshold of understanding exactly what life was like in the Olsons' home, what the daily reality they imposed on their charges entailed. We knew what was happening, we knew why it was happening, but now the moment had come for the final step, to reconstruct the picture of events to understand what it looked like on a daily basis. To do this, the investigation carefully studied Olson's testimony and that of those connected with the house, including the children. Once inside the Olsons' house, investigators tried to reconstruct the ordinary daily life, the very one that, they thought, concealed darker sides. The daily routine was, seemingly, absolutely ordinary. School, homework, dinner. That's what made up the days. The sheriff and his team were shocked by how carefully everything was arranged. How at first glance nothing betrayed the hidden cruelty. Everything seemed normal, even routine. On a superficial level, their house looked like any other family's home. But this was only an appearance. However, everything changed with the onset of night. After dinner, when the silence of the night descended upon the house, the real horror began. After the seemingly ordinary evening meal, psychological preparation would begin. Hours on their knees, praying for sins, learning correct thoughts. But this was not enough. Eventually, the real ritual began. This moment became the culmination of the daily night routine that the Olsons used to suppress will and break resistance. Every evening, the children were forced to pray for hours on their knees on the hard floor. This was not just an exercise in faith. Any mistake, any wrong word, deprivation of the next meal. These were methods whose goal was one, to break the spirit and subdue. In the evenings, their will became the subject of the strictest control. But this was only the beginning. When the prayers ended, the real nightmare began. The children were led to the quiet room, where they were tied to their beds with metal chains. All of this happened after a normal dinner, as part of their punishment. By night, the children found themselves in their confinement, where each night became agonizing, and the room itself, windowless and with thick walls, became their only home. There, in this dark, soundproof place, they were tied to their beds and remained so until morning. This process was not accidental. It was a conscious and planned system that continued for months. These nightly rituals became a systemic part of their lives, and all of this did not begin by chance. According to testimonies, they became part of the routine after Leo's first escape attempt in May 2004. This attempt became a turning point for the Olsons. The failed escape only strengthened their conviction in the necessity of applying such methods. This was not accidental behavior. It was an intention that was carefully planned and did not cease. Every day they repeated their actions, night after night. Investigations revealed that these rituals continued for over 5 months straight, every night. All of this was not some random breakdown, but part of a system that became the norm for this family. It was not a mistake, not a one-time action. It was a conscious practice that began in May and continued with terrifying regularity. And this fact became the final confirmation that the Olsons were not simply cruel people, but part of a belief system that justified these terrible actions. The investigation now had a complete picture of what had transpired. The Olsons tried to present all of this as a method of upbringing and spiritual purification. But for the investigators, it became clear that all of this was a carefully planned system. Pain, suffering, and isolation. All of this was part of their ideology. April 2005. The trial of Mark and Brenda Olson begins in the courtroom. After many months of gathering evidence, interrogations, and analyzing clues, The moment arrives when the fate of these two people will be decided. The question is no longer whether their actions were a crime. That has already been proven. The question is what the verdict of society in the person of the jury will be. How will they assess their behavior? What judgment will the judicial system deliver to those who consider themselves righteous, following their cruel and twisted beliefs? The prosecution presented its evidence: photographs, physical evidence, expert testimonies, DNA analysis results. Every detail testified to cruelty, to a system based on violence and isolation, which became part of the daily routine they arranged in their home. This evidence left no doubt. The defense, however, built its case on freedom of religion, arguing that their actions were not a crime, but merely an attempt to save souls based on religious beliefs. This was their main argument, but it could not overshadow the facts presented in court. When the judges and jury heard the arguments from both sides, they reached the final stage of this legal process. The court materials had been gathered, and now everything depended on how the jury would decide what to do with this complex case. Against the backdrop of these two opposing versions of reality, the court began its last phase, awaiting the verdict. The decisive moment arrived. There was a tense silence in the courtroom when the prosecutor displayed those very drawings on the screen, drawings made by the hands of the children who remained in that house. Children's drawings from the basement, with images of smiling parents and children, but with one nightmarish detail: thick black bracelets drawn on the hands and feet of the characters. The prosecutor silently showed them to the jury. This was perhaps one of the most powerful pieces of evidence, needing no words. These drawings became the silent testimony that could not be refuted. The room fell silent. The prosecutor did not utter a single word. He did not attempt to explain these images. He simply gave the jury time to comprehend the full gravity of what they had seen. The emotions in the courtroom were so strong that at this moment it was clear. No more words were needed. These drawings, as silent testimonies, became the strongest piece of evidence. This silence lasted for more than 1 minute, but no one doubted the meaning of these images. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. This was an unprecedentedly quick deliberation. They wasted no time on discussions because all the facts, evidence, and even the emotional impact of these clues left no room for doubt. They delivered a guilty verdict on all counts. Mark and Brenda Olson were found guilty. The sentence was announced the same day. Mark Olson was sentenced to 40 years in prison, and Brenda Olson to 25 years. The trial concluded, but this was only the first step towards restoring justice. The systematic violence and cruelty they employed in their home were now officially recognized as a crime. The trial is over, the verdict has been delivered, and it would seem that everything that could be said has already been said. But despite the public's anger being directed at the culprits, an important and unexplored part of this case remained. What happened to those connected with this horror, and what changes occurred after this event? These questions inevitably arose in many minds, and their answers became the next important step in this story. Leo and Maya, the two who fell victim to the Olsons' cruel system, were now safe. After the trial, they underwent rehabilitation to help them recover from the trauma they experienced. Their names were changed so they could start a new life, away from the previous horror. Their fate was hidden, and they were now in a witness protection program. Leaving their stories behind, where they were no longer subject to public attention, was a decision that gave them a chance for a normal future. The system that at one point failed to protect them now did everything it could to ensure their safety. The future of these individuals remained anonymous, and all that remained was hope that they would live in safety and peace. But there were also questions that remained unanswered. The entire case was sent to court, a verdict was rendered, and all suspects received their just punishment. But one important point remained. What happened to the community to which the Olsons belonged? Was their silence complicity? Investigations into other members of their community did not yield significant results. Despite investigators' attempts to clarify this issue, proving the awareness or complicity of other community members was unsuccessful. This question remained open and remains uncertain to this day. The story of the Olsons, their crimes, and their cruel ideology left a deep mark on society. This event not only changed the lives of two people, but also led to systemic changes in society. It reminded everyone how important it is not to turn a blind eye to the suffering of others, and how important it is to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The forensic expert's report stated more than 120 injuries were recorded on the body of Benjamin Wilson. These numbers leave no doubt about what happened to him. 120 is not just random injuries, it is the result of deliberate actions. Who and why could have done this to a boy who was barely 9 years old? Benjamin's body was found on April 10, 2005, in a shed in the backyard of his home. A place that could have been just a utility corner was turned into a site of a horrible discovery. The shed, where old things, tools, and other items are usually stored, became the place where he was found. And this only added to the shocking contrast. An ordinary family yard, a familiar place. And here a discovery was made that shocked everyone. The examination showed that the boy had endured several days of brutal trials. Forensic studies established Benjamin was subjected to physical abuse for 3 days. The blows were inflicted with a belt, and each of the injuries was the result of long and continuous violence. Some marks on his body indicated that the blows were struck with varying force, suggesting prolonged and systematic abuse. There was not a single spot on his body that did not bear marks. The boy endured this until he lost consciousness, and even after his condition became critical, he continued to be in the backyard. Surprisingly, Benjamin disappeared on April 7, 2005. His family did not immediately realize that something was wrong with him. His mother, Laura, was not overly worried at first, deciding that he had simply gone to a friend's house or was lost somewhere. But the searches yielded no results, and each day of his absence became more alarming. And only 3 days later, on April 10, what drastically changed the situation occurred. When he was found, everything became clear. The place where he was found and the circumstances under which it happened clarified all questions. As it turned out, the boy was found in his own yard, in a place that should always have been safe for him. He was not found far from home, and this fact only intensified the tragedy of what happened. He lived there, was part of that space, but it was there that he found himself at the center of a nightmare that few could have imagined in the peaceful and calm setting of an ordinary yard. Everything was so unexpected that at first, no one could believe that what was happening could be related to this place. But soon, everything became clear. Family members searched for him, but could not find him. Their searches, although they led to a certain result, this result turned out to be much more terrible than they could have imagined. How could such a thing happen in this very place, in this house, in an area where everything seemed to be under control? And so, when everything became clear, attention shifted to who was nearby, who could have been close and involved. This horror could not have happened without someone's involvement. Who was it that led to such terrible consequences? This is the most important question at the moment, and the answers to it will be sought during the investigation. When the first patrol officers arrived at the scene, nothing suggested what they were about to see. However, they did not yet know everything. The information received on the call was, to say the least, strange. Laura Wilson, Benjamin's mother, called the police on April 10, 2005, and the report stated that a boy had been found in her backyard. Yes, exactly. Found. There were no words about something terrible happening. There was no mention that something was clearly wrong with him. The statement was made calmly, without panic. And although the signs of trouble were already obvious, the initial details seemed mundane. When the officers arrived at the scene, Laura did not go into details. She simply said that her son had been found in the backyard. The place where tools, old things, and garden supplies were usually kept this time became the reason for the call. The police at the scene simply did not know what to expect. Such calls often do not involve anything serious. Someone got lost, someone fell, someone went too far and did not return. But such cases are not uncommon. But when the officers saw the boy lying on the ground, the picture quickly changed. Everything they expected fell apart at that moment. The boy was found without signs of life. His condition spoke for itself. The officers immediately realized that nothing was ordinary here. The crime scene was cordoned off, and the area was quickly designated as a crime scene. Against the background of typical calls for such cases, this was a completely new and disturbing circumstance. Initially, all the police could do was confirm the fact. These were not just external signs of injuries, it was something more. And the more officers examined the area, the clearer it became. Something was not adding up here. The view of the backyard, of this place where everything had been so peaceful and calm before, became increasingly disturbing. Everything now indicated that something unimaginable had happened here. So, at the moment when the officers finally took out their notebooks and began to record the first testimonies, they still could not fully comprehend what exactly they would have to deal with. Of course, none of the patrol officers could have imagined that what began as a routine call would soon turn into a real nightmare. And more importantly, what they found at the scene promised to uncover many hidden secrets. Every detail of what was happening in the backyard began to raise new questions. One thing was obvious. This was definitely not just a coincidence. On April 7, 2005, Laura Wilson contacted the police with a report of her son, Benjamin, missing. It all started like an ordinary missing person story. He did not come home on time, and Laura assumed he had stayed with a friend, playing at his house or with him. This was a perfectly normal explanation, and it sounded plausible. The boy often went out to play, and sometimes stayed out late, but always returned. But this time, something went wrong. Laura was in no hurry to raise the alarm. She waited until the next day, and when Benjamin still did not return, she decided to contact the police. It seemed normal, a standard situation. One way or another, she did not panic. The disappearance could have been just a coincidence. From Laura's testimony, it became clear that she was not particularly concerned in the first hours after Benjamin did not return. The explanation she gave to the police sounded absolutely normal. He probably stayed with a friend. She did not think that something terrible had happened. There was no feeling that her son was in trouble. This creates an interesting gap. Why, if the boy did not return on time, did she not feel threatened earlier? Why did she not take any steps in the first hours? What could have kept her from more decisive actions? The police received the report 24 hours later, and this time, gap becomes an important point in the investigation. Laura reported that she did not feel an urgent need to contact the police immediately. Perhaps it was just a misunderstanding, a common occurrence for such a situation. But after a day when her son still had not returned, she decided to seek help. It would seem that a delay in reporting a disappearance is not unusual. Many parents might similarly postpone their fear. However, should this be taken as ordinary carelessness? Or is there something more? It is quite possible that the delay in reaction is only the first of many strange moments in this case. According to Laura and her husband Ronald, before contacting the police, they took several steps to search for Benjamin. They tried to find him themselves, searched the neighborhood, and called friends. All of this looked like normal actions of worried parents. Calls to friends' parents, searches on neighboring streets. None of this seems strange. It seemed like they acted as they should have. But here is the paradox. Their actions seemed quite adequate, but the very fact that Benjamin was found only 30 meters from the house cast doubt on the sincerity of their searches. After all, if they were searching for him throughout the entire neighborhood, how could it be that the boy was so close to home? Shouldn't they have looked in their own yard first? The report was finally registered in the database as a missing person case. From that moment, from April 7, Benjamin was officially listed as a missing person. Laura and Ronald became the applicants, and to the police, they were the injured party. This creates an important turn. Everything seemed quite standard. Search, reports, expectations, a normal procedure. But soon, when the investigation begins, this will become an important point that will initiate a complex analysis of what actually happened that day. All of this will now be checked, and the question will arise: were the searches real, or was it merely a theatrical performance created to provide an alibi? When the investigative team arrived at the scene, the first thing they did was inspect the shed, the very place where Benjamin had been discovered a few days earlier. The inspection of this room was critically important because it was here, at first glance, that the whole truth lay. Everything that could shed light on what happened was hidden within the walls of this nondescript storage facility. But what exactly in this shed could tell of what was happening? When all entrances and exits were checked, the door immediately attracted attention. Outwardly, it did not appear damaged. No signs of forced entry, nothing to indicate violent entry. And this was an important discovery. If the door was not forced, it meant that someone who had access to this room could be much closer than it seemed. Criminologists immediately asked themselves who could have had a key to this shed or access to it. After all, it could not have been a random criminal who somehow got inside. This meant that the circle of suspects was narrowing. Someone from Benjamin's family or close circle could have had direct access to this place. This was the first and important signal not to look for the perpetrator among strangers or random people. It was important to focus on those who were in close proximity to the boy. The inspection of the shed continued. Investigators began searching for other clues that could confirm what happened here, and whether this place was actually connected to the crime itself or was simply used to cover up traces. Examining the floor, specialists noticed brownish stains. At first glance, there were not many, but the examination confirmed. It was blood. Blood, but in an insignificant amount. This cast doubt on the initial hypothesis. If Benjamin had so many injuries, why were there so few blood traces? Forensic experts immediately began to ponder. If there were 120 blows, why are there no larger blood traces on the shed floor? Where is all the other blood? Could this mean that the main part of the torture occurred elsewhere? The shed, as it turned out, was not the place where the main crime was committed. It could have been the place where the victim was held in the last moments, but not the place of the violence itself. This discovery led to new suspicion. Where then did these tortures take place, if not in the shed? This assumption was soon confirmed. The inspection showed that no signs of struggle or sharp traces that could indicate violent actions, as at the main scene of the crime, were found in the shed. Now the investigation was convinced. The shed could have simply been the place where the body was left to cover up traces. The main violence clearly took place somewhere else. The next steps of the investigation intensified. Now the most important thing was to understand how and exactly where all this happened. But first and foremost was the crucial opinion of the forensic expert, who was to conduct an examination and give his initial findings. When the expert arrived at the scene, he immediately drew attention to Benjamin's condition. Forensic examination confirmed that the number of injuries on his body was enormous. Hematomas, abrasions, marks from a belt, all of this spoke of multiple blows. But what caught the expert's attention was different. The injuries on the body had different degrees of age. Some hematomas were fresh, while others had already begun to heal. This definitely ruled out the version of a sudden murder in a fit of rage. There was something far more horrific here. Injuries sustained over several days meant one thing. Benjamin was subjected to prolonged torment. The forensic expert immediately designated this as key to the investigation. Multiple blows inflicted with intervals could indicate that the crime was not spontaneous but premeditated. It was a long and agonizing torment, not a quick reprisal. Now all doubts were dispelled. The investigation officially moved to the stage of a crime committed with particular cruelty, with systematic beatings, not accidental aggression. This meant that the investigation now had to seek an answer to the main question. Who could have been capable of such prolonged torment? Who was capable of torturing Benjamin day after day? After the investigative team narrowed down the circle of suspects, it was time to question those in Benjamin's immediate circle. Laura and Ronald Wilson were summoned to the police station to give official statements. They were questioned separately to rule out the possibility of coordinating their versions. The anticipation of this moment was tense. Everything now depended on how each of them would behave under pressure. Laura remained calm and confident throughout the interrogation. Her story was consistent and logical. She described in detail the events from April 7 to 10, when Benjamin disappeared. All her testimony matched what she had previously stated when she contacted the police. This, of course, did not make her innocent, but her version was convincing. Laura did not try to hide details or change facts. No strong emotions or dramatic statements were expected from her, but in the context of this interrogation, her calmness seemed natural. Unlike her, Ronald made a completely different impression during the interrogation. His testimony appeared less clear. Unlike Laura, he repeatedly got confused in details and seemed unable to accurately recall his actions over several days, including the evening of April 7. Gaps in memory became the first red flag for investigators. Why couldn't he accurately remember where he was or what he was doing that day? These inconsistencies could not go unnoticed. During the interrogation, Ronald claimed that he could not accurately describe his actions, asserting that he was drunk that evening. This seemed too convenient an excuse. Such memory gaps can sometimes be a sign that a person is hiding something, but it can also indicate something more disturbing, a loss of control. Even stranger was Ronald's claim that he had consumed alcohol that day and didn't keep track of time. His testimony clearly showed an attempt to reduce his responsibility for what happened, but this did not resolve the contradictions. Alcohol, of course, can cloud memory, but it can also be a factor capable of intensifying aggression and leading to unpredictable actions. And although his excuse could have been true, it simultaneously became evidence, not a defense. Alcohol, its consumption that evening, became an important element highlighting his unstable behavior and not providing a clear alibi for the key moment. Investigators noted that his alibi for the evening of April 7 was not confirmed by independent witnesses. He could not say exactly where he was during this period and could not provide witnesses who could confirm his words. All of this became a crucial moment that strengthened suspicions against him. His position looked too weak, and now he was in the spotlight. Against the background of all these inconsistencies, Ronald became the main suspect. All the facts pointing to Ronald began to form a coherent picture. He had unrestricted access to the shed, the place where Benjamin's body was found. He was nearby, he was part of this family, and essentially was the only person who could have committed such a crime. His memory gaps, lack of alibi, his aggressive behavior, all these factors put him at the forefront as the main suspect. The state of his alibi turned out to be the weakest of all, and his actions that evening raised more and more questions. Investigators could not ignore these suspicions. They had no direct evidence, but circumstantial evidence pointed directly to him. After analyzing all the facts and testimonies, Ronald Wilson was officially declared the main suspect in this case. Now the investigation had to move forward to understand his motives and actions. What exactly led him to such cruel behavior? And how deeply hidden are the motives that can explain such a terrible crime? Soon after the investigation began, they received the final pathologist's report. This document became a turning point in the investigation. While in the previous stages we only knew about the scale of the injuries, now everything became more specific. The report confirmed no less than 120 individual signs of blows were recorded on Benjamin's body. No matter how many times investigators tried to imagine the scale of what happened, these numbers always led to the thought, how could someone treat a person so cruelly? But the details did not end there. There was another key detail in the report. The injuries were caused by a flexible object, most likely a belt with a metal buckle, an ordinary object that can be found in any home, and this made the situation itself even more horrifying. This belt was the instrument with which Benjamin was struck repeatedly over a long period, and this was no longer just cruelty. It escalated into genuine torture. Another important detail was the confirmation of the duration of these tortures. The forensic expert confidently indicated the injuries were inflicted over approximately 72 hours. This figure was a shock to everyone involved in the investigation. 3 days, not one random blow, but systematic and targeted infliction of pain and fear. This was not an accidental occurrence, but agonizing torture. Tracking the healing stages of the hematomas helped experts establish a timeline. Blows were inflicted with breaks, which allowed for the conclusion that the suffering continued for several days. This fact not only became proof of the systematic nature of what was happening, but also opened a new question. How could a person continue such cruel behavior for 3 straight days? And why did no one notice this earlier? Based on the report data, investigators began to correlate scientific facts with Ronald's behavior. The most important task was to understand how he could have behaved during these 72 hours. According to his testimony, he continued to claim that his relationship with Benjamin was normal, that he had not committed any violent acts, and had no conflict with him. But now, after receiving the pathologist's data, these words began to sound even more unconvincing. Ronald refused to admit the fact of using force, stating that his relationship with the boy was normal. He was unaware of any problems and did not consider their family relationship alarming. This statement directly contradicted the results of the examination. There were marks on Benjamin's body that could not be hidden. These were traces of long and agonizing torture, not accidental conflicts. And although Ronald continued to assert that everything was normal, his words could not withstand any criticism, especially since all this time, what the investigation called prolonged torment was ongoing. Ronald's testimony and scientific data were in direct contradiction. The examination clearly indicated a prolonged period of violence, while Ronald continued to insist that his relationship with his stepson was within normal bounds. Ronald's position became increasingly shaky, and this could not go unnoticed. His assertions about normal relationships appeared to be an obvious lie, and the searches at the time he was questioned did not correspond to reality. The forensic medical report, which became undeniable evidence, left no room for doubt. Everything Ronald said was opposed to the facts. Now the investigation understood. Their task had become clear. They cannot simply rely on the suspect's words. The lie he tried to present as truth must be refuted by physical evidence, and the key piece of evidence they now needed to find was the murder weapon, specifically the belt with a metal buckle that could have been used to inflict these brutal blows. But the question was not only about the weapon, but also about other evidence that could directly link Ronald to this crime. Where was this belt? Could it be found in the house or somewhere else? This became the main task for the next stage of the investigation. Next, the investigation had to focus on finding the murder weapon, which could become the definitive proof. Ronald continued to be the main suspect, and now the detectives had everything to actively search for physical evidence linking him to this crime. After the investigation received the final examination results, a new stage of analysis began. Now, attention was focused on how Ronald behaved in the first moments after the body was found. All eyes were on him. He was the person who, according to testimony, discovered Benjamin. Behavior at the crime scene became an important part of the investigation. The report of the first officer who arrived at the scene recorded how family members behaved, and while Laura's reaction was within expectations, shock, tears, loss of control, Ronald's behavior immediately attracted the attention of investigators. He was calm, detached, as if what was happening did not concern him. There was no anxiety, no expressions of grief. This deviation from the norm immediately signaled to the investigation. The description of his behavior lacked words usually associated with grief or tragedy. Anxiety, confusion, a desire to understand what happened. Instead, there was cold calmness. While Laura was overcome with emotion, Ronald appeared more like an observer than a person who had just lost his stepson. He showed no hint of the storm of feelings expected from a mother who had lost her son. This atypical behavior, recorded in the protocols, attracted the attention of investigators, and, in the analytical note, the lead detective directly stated, Ronald's reaction was atypical for a parent who had just discovered their child. What lay behind this calmness? This was behavior that was difficult to explain. Perhaps it was related to his character, perhaps to his personal situation. But it immediately became clear that something was wrong here. Investigators began to ask themselves what this was: emotional detachment, a defensive reaction, or a sign that he knew much more than he could tell. But, most importantly, how Ronald behaved in the following days. While the investigation continued its work, trying to understand the circumstances of the tragedy, passivity and lack of interest in the investigation became another strange detail. The interrogation protocols did not record him showing activity, asking questions about the course of the investigation, or putting forward his versions of what happened. On the contrary, Ronald answered questions monosyllabically and without much enthusiasm. He did not try to help the investigation, did not offer hypotheses, did not show the slightest interest in solving this terrible incident. His behavior caused investigators increasing bewilderment. Why did he, being the closest person to Benjamin, not try to delve into the details of the investigation, not express concern? If someone else had lost a child, their emotions, their desire to understand what happened would be obvious. But not with Ronald. All of this indicated that his role in the investigation was not merely passive, he was becoming an obstacle. Alongside the interrogations, he offered no new information, showed no interest in anyone being found guilty. He did not participate in the search process, nor did he discuss the details of what had happened. Ronald's position appeared defensive, not cooperation, but silence and caution. This behavioral discrepancy could not have been a mere coincidence. It became another building block in the investigation, pointing to Ronald taking a stance utterly different from what the investigation expected from a simple, grieving father. It was entirely possible that his calm demeanor was just an attempt to conceal something far darker. Investigators began to form a psychological profile of the suspect based on his behavior. First and foremost, they noted a lack of empathy. A person who finds a loved one in such a terrible state should have shown far more emotion. Instead, Ronald remained indifferent and detached. This was compounded by his alcohol dependency, which also became a key element of the investigation. Alcohol not only distorted his perception of reality, but could also lead to inexplicable acts, aggression, and relationship destruction. His attempts to conceal information and ignore the investigators' questions became increasingly obvious. Leading detectives stated, his behavior on the day the body was found and during interrogations was not just strange, it was suspicious. Analyzing his behavior, the investigators understood that psychology might point to him as guilty, but without factual evidence, it was impossible to accuse him. One thing was clear: now, irrefutable physical evidence was required for an indictment. Lies and behavioral anomalies could not form the basis for an accusation. The next step was obvious. It was necessary to find real material evidence that would link Ronald to the crime. After experts determined the probable murder weapon, all attention of the investigation focused on finding this belt. A belt with a metal bucklet was no longer just an everyday item, but now a potential murder weapon. The investigation obtained a warrant to search the Wilson family home. This step was logical. The house is the first place where something matching the description should be. Detectives started with the most obvious, inspecting the residential building. The search revealed that there were several men's belts in the house, but none of them had obvious signs that could immediately indicate it was the one used. All belts were ordinary, without blood or other traces that could become evidence. Based on this, the first phase of the search could be considered unsuccessful. But what now? Where else could this belt be? The answer was obvious. If not in the house, then perhaps in Ronald's personal vehicle. And so, the investigators' attention shifted to the truck. Detectives began inspecting Ronald's truck, starting with the glove compartment and door pockets. Checking these obvious places yielded nothing unusual, only work tools and household trash. It seemed that the truck, like the house, would not provide an answer. Nevertheless, tension continued to mount. Investigators could not afford to relax, despite the lack of obvious clues. Just as they were beginning to think this search would end in failure, one of the detectives ran his hand under the driver's seat. And there, in the most unexpected part of the car, he felt something hard and smooth. This was not just a random find. He felt an object that could not simply be part of the trash or a tool. It was something else, something more important. The detective's heart pounded faster as he retrieved the object. It was a belt, a man's leather belt with a metal buckle, exactly the kind that could have been used to inflict blows. The evidence finally had been found. But this was only the beginning. Upon closer inspection of the belt, detectives noticed dark stains concentrated near its end. The initial assumption was immediately confirmed. These stains were possibly blood. This was almost 100% proof that this particular belt had been used in the crime. Now, all questions became much more specific. The item was carefully packaged and sent to the forensic laboratory for further examination. The entire procedure was documented. The evidence bag was marked, belt, possible murder weapon. This was the moment when everything began to fall into place. The investigation now possessed material evidence that could be the key to solving the crime. However, laboratory analyses still needed to be conducted to confirm that this was indeed the belt used on the day of the tragedy. The question of the belt's connection to the crime now became central to the entire investigation. After the belt was found in Ronald Wilson's truck, it was immediately sent for forensic examination. This was crucial evidence that could confirm or refute the investigators' theory that the belt had been used to inflict blows. All subsequent investigative actions now depended on what science would say. After passing through all stages, the belt arrived at the state's forensic laboratory, where specialists began a series of thorough examinations. The first task the experts set for themselves was to conduct a DNA analysis. This process was not quick, and achieving an accurate result required time. Biological material swabs were taken from the belt's surface and then sent for laboratory research. DNA extraction and comparison with a sample is a standard procedure, but every detail is important. And finally, the long-awaited result arrived. Traces of blood were found on the belt. But, most importantly, the match. The DNA on the belt perfectly matched Benjamin Wilson's DNA. This result became decisive. It established a direct link between the belt and the victim. This was not just an accidental splash of blood on an object. The belt had likely been the instrument with which Benjamin sustained his injuries. Now, the investigators had an absolutely precise and irrefutable fact. This was evidence that linked the belt to what had happened. But, of course, the investigators understood that this was not enough. It was important to establish not only the presence of blood, but also additional evidence that could reveal all the details of the crime. Experts continued to work, and their efforts led to additional results. After conducting a microscopic analysis of the belt, they discovered another important detail: microparticles of skin. These particles could not have been random. They were located where the belt had contacted the victim's skin. This was not just blood. These were traces of blows. The epithelial particles confirmed that the belt blows had been inflicted with such force that they tore the skin. This was not just blood flow, but real physical damage inflicted in a cruel manner. When the analysis results confirmed that the skin particles also belonged to Benjamin Wilson, the investigation received crucial corroboration. Now there was no doubt that the belt had been used to inflict pain. This was not an accidental bloodstain. It was a weapon of torture with which the boy had suffered cruel torment. The final stage of the laboratory's work concluded, and the official report was sent to the investigative department. The document clearly stated the belt was seized from Ronald Wilson's personal vehicle, and biological traces belonging to Benjamin Wilson were found on it. This meant that the investigation now had irrefutable evidence linking the suspect to the crime. This conclusion became the cornerstone of the investigation. For the investigators, it meant they could now move forward, not only regarding the belt's connection to the incident, but also concerning Ronald Wilson. With the evidence that the murder weapon was found and linked to the suspect's personal property, it was clear that a turning point had arrived in the case. Investigators already knew Ronald Wilson could no longer be just a witness. He became the main suspect, and this opened a new chapter in the investigation. Now, only one question remained. What would Ronald himself say when presented with this evidence? After the investigation received irrefutable evidence, the belt with Benjamin Wilson's blood, the moment for confrontation arrived. Ronald Wilson was called in for questioning again. Now the investigation had a piece of evidence that directly linked him to the crime. He could no longer remain in the role of a witness. All questions were clear, and the investigators needed to see his reaction. When Ronald entered the interrogation room, the detectives had already prepared the material to present. On the table lay that very belt leather with a metal buckle, which had been discussed throughout the investigation. Ronald was shown it, and the expert's conclusion was read. Biological traces matching Benjamin's DNA were found on the belt. Now, there was no doubt the belt was not just a random object. It was the murder weapon. However, Ronald's reaction was quite predictable. He immediately denied all accusations, stating that he had never used this belt to inflict blows. There was no shock in his eyes, no desire to justify himself, only firm denial. He tried to remain calm, but the investigators already knew. His words were not supported by facts. He did not confess and immediately began to invent explanations. The investigators wasted no time and continued to ask questions. The blood on the belt, which could not simply be ignored, forced Ronald to put forward a ridiculous version. He began to say that perhaps Benjamin had hurt himself when he had a nosebleed, or that the belt had been stained during some fight with other children. He described the boy as difficult and claimed that Benjamin often got into arguments. This explanation, as expected, sounded weak. It was an attempt to shift the blame to external circumstances and distract attention from himself. Ronald said that maybe the belt just ended up in the wrong place, but none of his versions sounded convincing. All of this did not seem sincere. Rather, it felt like a desperate attempt to save himself. The investigators could not ignore this version. Of course, they needed to check every aspect, even the most ridiculous, to make sure they hadn't missed anything important. The examination of Benjamin's environment began, and first and foremost, his behavior and interactions with other children. Could anyone have witnessed those fights Ronald spoke of? Were there confirmations of his story? The answers quickly became obvious. Benjamin's teachers, who were interviewed, categorically refuted Ronald's version. They described the boy as a calm and hard-working student who did not get into fights. The school nurse also had no records of frequent injuries or nosebleeds in Benjamin. Moreover, Benjamin's friends, with whom investigators also spoke, described him as a peaceful, friendly teenager. No information that he frequently argued with other children was received. Every new piece of testimony shattered Ronald's version. His attempts to blacken the boy's character, portraying him as a difficult teenager, had no real basis. Friends, teachers, and the nurse all said the same thing. Benjamin was not aggressive or prone to fights. This was a complete lie, and the investigation began to finally understand that Ronald was not simply mistaken. He was trying to invent a story that had nothing to do with reality. When all this testimony was gathered, Ronald's version was officially closed. He tried to shift the blame to someone else, but none of his explanations were confirmed by facts. The lies he so desperately tried to create were exposed, and the investigation was now confident in one thing. Ronald Wilson knew much more than he was saying. All his behavior, from the strange reaction to the discovery of the body to the lie about the reasons for the blood on the belt, pointed to him as the main suspect. Now the investigation knew that his version had been completely refuted, and a new question became key. What else was hidden in Ronald's past that could explain his behavior and actions? After Ronald's version that the blood on the belt could have appeared accidentally was refuted, the investigation decided to dig deeper. It was obvious that the answers to many questions lay in his past. To understand who he truly was and how his character could have led to such a brutal reprisal, investigators began an in-depth background check on Ronald Wilson. All of this was necessary not only to further strengthen their theory, but also to understand whether he was indeed the kind of person capable of such acts. During this investigation, it was discovered that Ronald was not an untarnished man. His arrests surfaced in documents, two incidents that became an important part of his criminal past. In 2002, he was apprehended for driving under the influence, and in 2004, for disturbing public order while intoxicated. These facts were not rumors or conjectures, but official records. And while such incidents on their own might seem accidental, their frequency pointed to a much more serious problem. Ronald did not just periodically break the law. He became part of a pattern where alcohol and aggressive behavior were linked. This behavioral pattern, where drinking became a catalyst for conflicts, now fully aligned with his current state and family relationships. Ronald's history with alcohol and his propensity for aggressive behavior created an increasingly clear picture. He was not just an ordinary person with problems everyone faces. He was someone who likely could not cope with emotions when he drank, and these moments led to the destruction of his life and the lives of those around him. This conclusion about his legal troubles became the basis for a new investigative strategy. Investigators knew he had a tendency toward violence, and now they needed to understand how this manifested in his relationship with Benjamin. Investigators decided to return to Laura Wilson. Now that they had facts about Ronald's past, they could pressure her. Understanding that her husband was not only aggressive but also constantly lashing out at people forced them to ask her more frank questions. Laura was called for questioning again, and now she had to answer questions concerning her relationship with her husband, as well as the arguments that occurred in the family. When Laura was presented with the facts about Ronald's past, her answers changed. She began to speak more openly than before. Under the pressure of evidence, she admitted that arguments between Ronald and Benjamin were regular. Ronald was strict, short-tempered, especially when he drank. This confession became the first confirmation that there were real problems in the family that everyone seemed to be ignoring. But when investigators asked why she didn't intervene, why she didn't try to stop the arguments, Laura gave a strange answer. She said she didn't think it was that serious. She did not perceive these conflicts as a threat, despite their regularity. This answer became a key moment in the investigation. Laura realized something was wrong, but did not try to intervene. She did not believe that the arguments could lead to something more terrible. Such inaction played a fatal role. Laura was part of this family and, in essence, could have prevented further developments, but she did not. Her passivity put her in the position of an accomplice, at least through negligence. This opened a new question for the investigation. Why did she not take steps to protect her son? Why did she not draw the attention of the authorities? Not confront Ronald if the situation was so tense? Now the investigation could clearly see how the whole picture was forming. Ronald was a man with alcohol-related problems, a tendency towards aggression, and, as often happens, his rage was directed at those closest to him. Benjamin apparently became the last link in this chain when the slightest disobedience could cause an explosion. Ronald's aggression and his constant arguments with Benjamin led to the tragedy. And now, thanks to the discovery of Ronald's past and Laura's confessions, the investigation was finally able to reconstruct the events. This was not a random act of violence. It was the result of months and years of conflicts that only escalated until they became irreversible. The investigation clearly saw that Ronald had a clear motive: alcohol, aggression, and accumulated hostility. This was not a pre-planned act, but the result of a sudden escalation of an ordinary family conflict that became a tragedy. The situation clarified, and now the investigation could move to the final stage. All key evidence had been gathered. There was the belt, confirmation of its connection to Benjamin, a broken alibi, false testimonies, and now even a psychological profile of the suspect. Investigators were ready for the final confrontation. One question remained: how would Ronald react when all this evidence was presented to him? Finally, the moment of truth arrived. All clues were gathered, all evidence in the hands of the investigation. Ronald Wilson was to answer questions that had long caught up with him. He was brought to the interrogation room, and the video camera was switched on. At that moment, the detectives were determined. Unlike previous meetings where he could try to evade the truth, today he had to face the facts. The detectives did not rush. They acted methodically, laying out the cards before Ronald one by one. First, they read aloud all the inconsistencies in his alibi, which did not withstand any criticism. Then they showed him photographs of the belt and read the expert's conclusion, where it was written in black and white. The blood on the belt belonged to Benjamin. For Ronald, this was a blow. He was silent. At this moment, it became obvious that his defense was broken. He did not object, did not deny, just remained silent. The pause lasted 2 minutes and 14 seconds. It was in this silence that the detectives felt his armor begin to crack. Investigators gave him no time to think. They knew he had to answer questions he could not ignore. Now that they had the evidence and all the facts in hand, they shifted to something more personal. Ronald could always deny that he was the one who inflicted the blows, but now they had to unleash the truth from within the family on him. Detectives began to read Laura's testimony, his wife, that arguments between him and Benjamin were frequent, that Ronald often showed aggression, especially when he drank. Laura confessed that she knew about these arguments, but did nothing, considering them ordinary family problems. This was like the final blow to his position. He could no longer hide behind lies. His wife, with whom he lived, was now testifying against him. At this moment, his defense collapsed. He did not try to justify himself, did not lie anymore. Instead, his first words became an admission of his internal breakdown. He was unbearable. This was not a direct confession, but it was no longer a denial. He tried to explain his actions, but no longer hid that something had gone wrong. The detectives, without wasting time, asked the last decisive question. Ronald, tell us, what happened on April 7? This was the moment when his silence could not continue. Ronald began to speak. All he could say were a few broken phrases. He talked about an argument, about how everything got out of control. He mentioned alcohol, and finally confessed, "I hit him with the belt." These words became the culmination of the investigation. He admitted that he inflicted the blows and that it was a fatal mistake. When the detectives asked him if he confessed to the murder, Ronald did not deny it. The answer was brief but precise. Yes. This confession was recorded and became official confirmation. The crime was solved and the culprit was found. After Ronald Wilson's confession, the investigation could not yet rest. Although he admitted to inflicting the blows, his confession had to be verified to close all gaps. During the interrogation, he mentioned an important detail that had previously remained unknown. He said that the violence began not in the shed, as previously thought, but in the living room. He claimed that at that moment, blood got onto the carpet, which he then tried to wipe away with cleaning solution. This new information immediately caught the attention of the investigators. If he indeed tried to wash away the traces, it could be the key to finally unraveling the whole picture. The decision was not long in coming. A re-examination of the house was ordered. With the help of forensic experts, the living room carpet was checked using luminol, a chemical substance that fluoresces in the presence of blood, even if it has been washed away. This creation of a blue glow in the dark added even more tension to this investigation. The carpet was treated with the solution, and the room was darkened. Specialists carefully monitored the substance's reaction, and the result was not long in coming. A bright blue glow appeared in the center of the carpet, confirming the presence of blood hidden from sight. This was the evidence that finally confirmed Ronald's words. After this, samples were taken from this area of the carpet for DNA analysis. The laboratory confirmed the blood found on the carpet belonged to Benjamin Wilson. This not only confirmed Ronald's confession, but also proved that he tried to hide traces of the crime, destroying evidence in the house. The attempt to conceal traces of the crime completely destroyed his possible defense. Now, the investigation was confident. They had not just a confession, but irrefutable evidence that Ronald Wilson was the one who committed the crime and tried to hide his actions. All the facts connected, and the case began to form into a final picture. The next step was obvious: to ascertain all the details of the crime, how they occurred, and to prepare the materials for trial. After all the evidence was gathered, Ronald's confession was officially recorded, and the case was sent to court. In the courtroom, his lawyers tried to mitigate his responsibility, arguing that the crime occurred in a state of passion and was not premeditated murder. However, despite all attempts at justification, the collected evidence, including the confession, DNA analysis, blood traces, and the attempt to conceal evidence, left no doubt about his guilt. The court found Ronald Wilson guilty of the murder of Benjamin Wilson. Psychological analysis confirmed that his aggression was not accidental, but had accumulated over a long period, and that he was capable of controlling his actions. Therefore, despite mitigating circumstances related to alcohol and personal problems, Ronald was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Laura Wilson, Benjamin's mother, was found guilty of criminal negligence. She did not intervene in the ongoing conflicts and did not try to prevent the tragedy, despite regular arguments in the family. Her sentence was less severe. She received a suspended sentence and was ordered to undergo a course of psychotherapy. After the trial, the Wilson family was shattered. Ronald ended up in prison. Laura continued to live with a sense of guilt and loss. The family, which once seemed ordinary, was now part of a tragedy that left a deep mark on the lives of everyone who knew them. Soon after the process, Laura's rehabilitation began, but she never recovered from the guilt of not intervening in time. The tragedy became a lesson for many, not only for her family, but also for those who observed this case and, perhaps for the first time, understood how important it is to monitor family relationships and not ignore signs of violence, even if they seem insignificant.